The rain hammered against the glass doors as Emma stood dripping wet, staring at the one person she never wanted to see again. Daniel Carter, her rival, her enemy, and now, according to the apologetic desk clerk, her roommate for the night in the lodge's last available room. Welcome to our channel Truth Turn Stories, where real-life truths turn into powerful lessons. If this story speaks to you, subscribe and support the journey. By morning he was calling her my future wife. The rain hammered against the glass doors of the tiny mountain lodge as Emma stood dripping wet in the cramped lobby, her suitcase forming a puddle at her feet, staring at the one person in the entire world she never wanted to see again. Daniel Carter stood there too, equally soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his jaw tight with that same stubborn expression she'd grown to despise over 3 years of fierce competition at their marketing firm. The elderly woman behind the desk spread her weathered hands apologetically and repeated what seemed impossible. "I'm so sorry, but with the roads washed out and the conference overflow, we have exactly 1 room left. You'll have to share it or sleep in your cars, and trust me, dears, you don't want to be out there tonight." Emma's heart sank as she looked at Daniel, whose steel-gray eyes met hers with equal horror and resignation. They'd been rivals since the day he joined the company, constantly competing for the same clients, the same promotions, the same recognition. She'd called him arrogant, he'd called her stubborn. Their colleagues joked about selling tickets to their boardroom battles, and now, stranded by a freak storm in the middle of nowhere, they'd have to spend an entire night together in 1 room. Emma grabbed her suitcase and marched toward the stairs without a word, too exhausted to argue, her heels clicking against the worn wooden steps. Daniel followed in silence, both of them dripping a trail of rainwater down the narrow hallway. The room was smaller than she'd feared, with faded floral wallpaper, 1 double bed, and a threadbare armchair that had seen better decades. She immediately pointed at the bed and declared she'd take the chair, refusing to owe him anything, not even comfort. But Daniel shook his head firmly and said he'd sleep on the floor before letting anyone take a chair when there was a bed available, and she countered that she didn't need his chivalry, thank you very much. They stood there, 2 stubborn souls drenched and shivering, locked in yet another battle of wills until Daniel finally sighed and said they'd figure it out after they both got warm and dry. He disappeared into the tiny bathroom first, and Emma sat on the edge of the bed, hugging herself, wondering how her life had led to this moment of cosmic irony. When Daniel emerged in dry clothes, his expression had softened slightly, and he quietly suggested she take a hot shower before she caught a cold. His voice lacked its usual sharp edge, and something about his genuine concern caught her off guard. She nodded and grabbed her bag, grateful for the privacy and the warmth. Under the steaming water, Emma let herself finally relax, her shoulders dropping as the tension of the day washed away. She thought about how she'd always seen Daniel as nothing more than an obstacle, a competitor, someone trying to steal her thunder. But standing in that lobby, she'd noticed for the first time how his eyes had flickered with worry when the desk clerk mentioned sleeping in the cars during the storm. He'd actually looked concerned for her safety. She pushed the thought away and focused on getting warm. When she came out wrapped in comfortable clothes, her long hair damp around her shoulders, Daniel had arranged extra blankets on the floor beside the bed and had set up a makeshift sleeping area for himself. The gesture was so unexpectedly kind that Emma felt her throat tighten. She told him that was ridiculous, that they were both adults and could share the bed with a pillow barrier like civilized people, but Daniel insisted he'd be fine on the floor. They went back and forth until Emma finally sat down on the bed and asked him point blank why he was being so difficult. Daniel sat in the armchair across from her, and for the first time in 3 years he looked at her without defenses. He said he knew she thought he was arrogant and ruthless, and maybe he'd given her reason to think so, but his mother had raised him to be a gentleman, and he wasn't about to let that go just because they didn't get along. His voice was quiet, almost vulnerable, and Emma felt something shift in her chest. She apologized for assuming the worst about his motives, admitting she'd been so focused on protecting her position that she'd never considered he might actually be a decent person beneath the competition. Daniel laughed softly, a warm sound she'd never heard before, and said he'd thought the same about her, that all he'd seen was someone determined to prove him wrong at every turn, never the brilliant, passionate woman, who clearly loved her work. The conversation that followed surprised them both. Sitting across from each other in that small room with rain drumming against the window, they began to talk like human beings instead of adversaries. Daniel shared how he'd grown up helping his single mother run a struggling bakery, learning early that hard work and determination were the only ways forward. Emma told him about being the first in her family to go to college, about the pressure she felt to succeed, to prove she deserved her seat at the table. They talked about their fears, their dreams, the projects they'd loved and lost. Daniel admitted he'd actually admired her creativity on the Henderson campaign, the one she thought he'd tried to sabotage, and Emma confessed she'd been impressed by his presentation skills during the Parker pitch. The hours slipped by unnoticed as they shared stories, laughed at misunderstandings, and slowly began to see each other clearly for the first time. Emma watched Daniel's face as he spoke about his niece's graduation, how his eyes lit up with pride, and she wondered how she'd ever thought those eyes were cold. Around midnight, Daniel made tea using the room's small electric kettle, and they sat on the bed together, backs against the headboard, cups warming their hands. Emma noticed how careful he was not to invade her space, how respectful he remained even as the conversation grew more intimate. He asked her what she wanted beyond the promotions in the corner office, and she found herself sharing dreams she'd never spoken aloud, about wanting to mentor young women entering the field, about maybe starting her own consultancy someday. Daniel listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, building on her ideas with enthusiasm rather than competition. He told her she'd be incredible at it, that he'd seen how junior staff gravitated toward her for advice. His words carried no agenda, no rivalry, just honest recognition of her gifts, and Emma felt tears prick her eyes because she couldn't remember the last time someone had seen her so clearly. She asked him the same question, and Daniel stared into his tea for a long moment before admitting he was tired of the corporate ladder, that what he really wanted was to do meaningful work that helped communities, maybe focusing on nonprofits and social enterprises. His voice carried a wistfulness that touched her deeply. Emma said she could absolutely see him doing that beneath all his competitive drive, she'd always sensed he was motivated by something deeper than money or status. Daniel looked at her with surprise and gratitude, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. The air in the room shifted, becoming charged with a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea or the radiator humming in the corner. Emma's heart began to beat faster as she realized she was seeing Daniel Carter, truly seeing him for the very first time. And the man before her was nothing like the enemy she'd imagined. Daniel reached over and gently took her empty cup, setting both cups on the nightstand, and when he turned back, his eyes held a question. He said he needed to tell her something, that sitting here with her had made him realize how much time they'd wasted on rivalry when they could have been allies, maybe even friends. His voice dropped lower as he admitted, Ted, that somewhere in the past few hours, he'd started seeing her not as a competitor, but as someone extraordinary, someone he wanted to know in every possible way. Emma's breath caught as his words confirmed what she'd been feeling too, this strange and beautiful recognition that the person she'd thought was her enemy might actually be the person who understood her best. She told him she felt it too, this unexpected connection, this sense that perhaps the universe had trapped them in this room for a reason, to tear down the walls they'd built and show them what had been there all along. They talked until dawn painted the windows pink, sharing everything they'd hidden behind professional masks, discovering alignment where they'd assumed opposition, finding harmony in their differences. Daniel told her about the moment he'd first seen her, how fierce and brilliant she'd been in that staff meeting, how intimidated he'd felt, and how he'd covered it with bravado. Emma laughed and confessed she'd done the same thing, that his confidence had threatened her, so she'd armored up and gone to war. They marveled at how much energy they'd spent fighting when they were actually so similar. Two driven people from humble backgrounds trying to prove themselves in a world that didn't always make space for them. As the sun broke through the clouds, Daniel reached for Emma's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers naturally, perfectly, and he said something that made her heart soar. He told her he knew it was crazy, that 12 hours ago they'd been enemies, but sitting here now, he couldn't imagine going back to a life where she wasn't in it, where he didn't get to hear her laugh. See, our smile, learn what made her come alive. Emma squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with tears of joy, and told him she felt exactly the same way, that somehow in one extraordinary night, everything had changed. Daniel cupped her face gently and said he was going to tell everyone at the office that the storm had given him the greatest gift, that he'd found not just a partner but his future wife. And though he was grinning, his eyes were absolutely serious. Emma laughed through happy tears and told him he was getting ahead of himself, but her heart was already answering yes to the question he hadn't quite asked. They fell asleep as the sun rose, curled together on top of the covers, hands still clasped, two former enemies who'd discovered that sometimes the person challenging you the most is actually the person who sees you best, who pushes you to grow, who's been your perfect match all along wearing the disguise of opposition. When they walked into the office the following Monday, hand in hand, their colleagues' shocked faces were priceless. Daniel announced to anyone who'd listen that Emma wasn't his rival anymore but his future wife. And though some people thought he was joking, the way he looked at her told the truth. Emma glowed beside him, no longer competing but complementing, no longer fighting but partnering. They became the office's most unexpected success story, proof that transformation can happen in a single night when two people finally drop their defenses and see each other's hearts. Within a year, they'd left the firm together and started their own consultancy, combining her creativity with his strategy, focusing on helping nonprofits and social enterprises, doing the meaningful work they'd both dreamed about. And when Daniel proposed officially, kneeling in the lobby of that same mountain lodge where they'd been stranded, Emma said yes through joyful tears, grateful for the storm that had forced two enemies into one room and given them both the greatest love they'd never known they needed. Their story became the one people told when they needed hope, when they needed to believe that enemies could become lovers, that competition could transform into collaboration, that sometimes what we think we want is just a shadow of what we actually need. Emma and Daniel learned that the person opposing you isn't always your enemy, but sometimes your mirror, reflecting back the fears and insecurities you haven't faced, pushing you to become stronger and better. They discovered that walls built from misunderstanding crumble quickly in the presence of honest conversation and vulnerable hearts. They proved that one night of truth-telling can rewrite years of assumptions, that courage to see beyond first impressions opens doors to extraordinary love, and that sometimes the universe conspires in mysterious ways, using storms and small hotel rooms and impossible circumstances to bring together two souls who were always meant to find each other. Their wedding invitation quoted what Daniel had said that rainy night, words that became their philosophy for everything that followed. The greatest partnerships begin when we stop competing and start completing each other. And every anniversary, they return to that mountain lodge, to the room where enemies became lovers, where judgment became understanding, where two guarded hearts opened wide enough to let in the kind of love that changes everything, reminding themselves and everyone who heard their story that transformation is always possible when we choose vulnerability over victory, connection over competition, and love over everything else we thought mattered more.